Greetings. Welcome to our panel, Looking in the Mirror, Reflections on Diversity in NCA. My name is Jennifer Willis Rivera, and I am at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I received my PhD at Bowling Green State University in 1997, and my first NCA conference was in 1993, which was really a long time ago for me. But I wanted to put this panel together because I have seen diversity discussed, debated, argued, embraced throughout the time that I've been to NCA, and the people who are here at the table with me have played an immense part in what I've seen, but they also have histories that I have not been privy to. So bringing together this panel to hear their stories and to hear how they understand diversity happening at NCA, what their narrative is on that, was the purpose of this panel. So without further ado, we will start with Carolyn Calloway Thomas from Indiana University.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all of you. I'm really delighted to be here at this conference. In the Metaphysics of Morals, philosopher Immanuel Kant offers a beautiful, guiding and uplifting principle for understanding how we measure the substance of human beings. He offers a way of our knowing whether human beings are being taken seriously and whether they matter in the world. Said he, humanity itself is a dignity, for man cannot be used as a means by any man. He is under obligation to acknowledge in a practical way the dignity of humanity in every other man. On this day, when I'm called upon to look in the mirror and offer some reflections on the nature, salience, and substance of diversity in the National Communication Association, I cannot help pondering Kant's splendid declaration that we are under obligation to acknowledge in a practical way the dignity of humanity in every other human being. Because the presence or absence of blacks, Latinos, Asians, and others in this association is a way of reckoning with whether over the past 100 years we have been in shadows instead of in the light, and whether our dignity as human beings has been recognized and affirmed in this association. The notion of human dignity is intimately tied to questions of recognition. And at what point, when, and how, and under what circumstances did SCA and later the NCA acknowledge the dignity of humanity in diverse people? Today, on the occasion of the celebration of the 100th anniversary of that precious 1914 Declaration of Independence, where teachers of speech argued compellingly that they ought, by right, be free to find and sustain their voices amidst a sea of English teachers, I am pleased to report that from my perspective, the state of diversity in the NCA is robust. To understand why I'm offering this positive declaration today, let us go back in time, over 30 years ago, and see our reflections in a different, distant kind of mirror. I want to take you to New Orleans, where I attended my first SCA conference as a mere youth. There in New Orleans, at my first Speech Communication Association, I looked around and witnessed a sea of whiteness. And literally, almost instantaneously, I knew what the state of diversity was in the SCA. At my inaugural New Orleans conference, I knew precisely how many blacks were there, and their very bodies were a dramatic argument about the salience and substance of diversity in the SCA. I could count the number of people of color at that convention on my left hand or my right hand. Malefi Santi of the University of Buffalo, Landry Niles of Howard University, Joanne Graham of New York, and yours truly. So then, what metrics am I using today to support my bold claim that diversity is alive and well in the NCA? Although some of my colleagues may and would and might argue contrarily, in the rest of my time, I want to articulate briefly why I believe that diversity is alive in the NCA. First, the NCA is not where and what it used to be. Although we are not where we could be, let us thank our African chi that we are not where we used to be. We have come some distance since 1970, where Melvin Cummings and Jack Daniel and others had to mount a powerful, urgent, piercing argument for inclusion, and when members of the Black Caucus had to argue diligently to address the fact that no African American had ever served as president of the NCA. The fact that today I see different faces in the place is a lovely reminder of how far we have come by standards of dignity, visibility, inclusion, and goodwill. I see Asians, Latinos, blacks, gays and lesbians, graduate students, retired professors, high school teachers, and individuals from the rural heartland of America, all participating vigorously in the association. And I know that some special individuals in the association have facilitated the movement toward inclusion. Names of Bill, Edie, Jim Gardino, Anita Taylor, Jane Blankenship, Jim Tresbury, and Judy Trent come readily to mind. I cannot give enough praise to Judy Trent, who revealed in a practical, moving way philosopher Kant's principle that humanity itself is a dignity. Since as president of the NCA, she performed this principle vividly and beautifully when she focused our attention on racial and ethnic diversity. The focus found expression in all sorts of things, in a summer conference and in a task force of which I was a member, and in a candlelight vigil in San Diego that I remember so well because it was dreadfully cold that day in San Diego. And I remember saying to Judith, unless I go on now, I will not be able to talk because my teeth were literally chattering. But that candlelight vigil symbolized the necessary conditions for promoting the common good, the good we share in common. As vice president of the National Communication Association, Judy did other things that I do not have enough time to articulate here. Second, in terms of numbers and the structure of the association, blacks and Latinos have served as co-editors of journals. We've served as chairs of different divisions. We've served as chairs of the nominating committee, chairs of the committee on committee, chair of the finance board, and other influential and meaningful positions. In terms of awards, diverse individuals have won the Robert J. Kibler Award, the Carl R. Wallace Memorial Award, the Donald Ackroyd for Outstanding Teaching and Higher Education, the Franklin S. Heyman Award, and I could go on naming the number of awards that individuals have received. But the powerful question, the compelling question is whether we have done enough things to make the association credible in the area of diversity. So I hope that my present mirror is not rose-colored, but rather one that is clear and compelling when I argue that collectively the positions that blacks and others have held and continue to hold in the association are further testament to the impressive achievements of the organization in the area of diversity. And third and finally is goodwill. Goodwill is powerfully persuasive and generative. Cartographically speaking, using the spaciousness of goodwill as our test, one must look at NCA spatially and ask whether the proverbial spot of ground that we occupy each year matters. Is there a stirring, meaningful story here in terms of relational and special connectivity? And again, my answer is yes. At the end of the day, this is what Kant meant when he urged us to acknowledge in a practical way the dignity of humanity in all humans. There are no borders and boundaries in terms of what blacks and others can continue to achieve in the association. In the Goodwill and Spatial Department, NCA is not wavering from Martha Nussbaum's lovely tenet. And she said, being human means accepting promises from others and trusting that others will be good to you. On the occasion of this celebration, NCA is trustworthy and has been keen to help speak into existence a goodwill toward diversity, as well as a practice of diversity that I hope will long endure. Thank you.
Next, we have Alberto Gonzalez from Bowling Green State University.
And I have a PhD from Ohio State University. And when I first attended the NCA convention, I believe it was the 70th annual convention. And so I'm going to focus on the late 1980s and the 1990s. That's when there was a lot of activity, and I'm very delighted to be here at this table with Terry, Gordon, Young, and Carolyn. They are very powerful voices, and over the decades, we've all made various contributions to the discipline and to NCA to help create a sense of diverse voices and research in the experiences of attendees here at the convention. I guess my theme here is that I've always just started to put myself where I know I don't belong, and including maybe this panel. I'm not sure. But when I was attending the NCA conventions as a grad student and assistant professor, I had much the same kind of experience that Carolyn has mentioned, where there truly was a lack of diversity. But then moving into the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was an explosion of critical literature in our journals. And so you have terms not just talking about rhetoric, but critical rhetoric, and not just ethnographic studies, but critical ethnographic studies. And so in the area of international intercultural research, there was an explosion where people had taken an interpretive and critical turn, and that was something that I participated in. And so there were individuals like Kent Ono and Tom Nakayama and Marsha Houston and Victoria Chen who were really doing very innovative work that was inspiring to me in order to keep trying to put myself where I don't belong, and part of that would be in our academic journals, in doing different editorships and in service opportunities as well. But NCA is somewhat opportunistic and turns to examining diversity at certain particular moments. And I remember as we got into the late 1990s, Judy Trent had been the president, and she put out a book, an edited book, Views from the Helm for the 21st Century, and the whole notion of the millennial change was an opportunity for NCA to examine itself and examine its relationship to diversity. And so at that time, I remember Dolores Tano and I were on a Sharing the Wealth presentation, a Sharing the Wealth panel on intercultural dialogue, perspectives on the study of culture and communication. In 1997, again leading up to the millennium, the new millennium, we had the Conference of the Americas, which was in Mexico City, and Judy Trent helped to organize that. Jim Chesbrough helped to organize that. And so a group of us went to Mexico City and engaged with Mexican and Latin American communication scholars. And we talked about our similarities and our differences. And that was a very wonderful opportunity. And the inspiration for that continues to this day at NCA conventions. There were numerous panels that we had created over the years to keep on drawing attention to diversity in research, in our membership, and in the kinds of in our structures here within NCA. And so all of those things are things that a bunch of us participated in, and there were some very notable achievements. For example, the travel grants, which we called Student of Color travel grants, began with a $5,000 allocation, and then it went to a $10,000 allocation, then a $15,000 allocation, and it's going to grow from there. And that does demonstrate the organization's commitment to try to facilitate the attendance of diverse members. Back in the late 1990s, Dolores Tano and I did edit 3 volumes of the International Intercultural Communication Annual. And again, that was a place where perhaps we didn't belong, but we wanted to create a new sense of what intercultural communication research could be. And so we added topics like rhetoric and politics and connected that to intercultural communication. And we took opportunities to publish individuals who were then new scholars, like Lisa Flores and Rona Halualani, individuals who have now come into their own and are very important voices and leaders within the organization. We also took the opportunity to create the Latino-Latina Communication Studies Division. That was a big moment. So there wasn't simply La Raza Caucus. There was a division that would be able to host panels to display or have represented important scholarship. But more than that, it helped to create a community where people could help each other out. They were able to create a network so that if individuals needed assistance along any kind of domain, there was a growing network that we could rely upon. And that sense of community was very important, and I'm sure that for a lot of us, it's what keeps us coming to the convention. We know that we are going to see individuals who not only read our work and are interested in our work, but really do care about us as individuals. And I think that speaks to the goodwill that Carolyn was mentioning a little while ago. But I do have to say that during the late 80s, in the 1990s, there were individuals like Jim Godino, Judy Trent, Jim Chesbrough, who had very good relationships across the caucuses, across the divisions, and would work with us to ask us what our thoughts were, what our suggestions might be. And that was for me as an assistant professor, that was tremendous mentoring. I learned a lot about the organization. And in terms of diversity, I know that there's still support within NCA for diversity, but perhaps because the nature of the roles of leadership have changed, I certainly would encourage individuals in the leadership positions to maintain relationships with as many members as possible. There's a tendency when organizations get fairly affluent and fairly established, for them to have more of a corporate feel to them, and hopefully that can be balanced by continuing strong relationships that individuals will have with each other. I know that's important for me. And so we've continued to provide service, as Carolyn has mentioned. At one point, I was the chair of the International Intercultural Division. That was a huge job. I never thought I would have an opportunity to do something like that. I served 2 terms with the Affirmative Action and Intercaucus Committee, and my first experience was with that was through Terry Nance, who was a former chair of that committee, and I admire her work. When I was new to the organization, she just provided such strong leadership and gave me confidence that I could belong here and that people were looking out for us here in the organization. And so I've had these opportunities to be able to perform in these leadership positions, and I'm grateful to NCA for that, and I'm grateful for the opportunities to publish in the journals that NCA, under the auspices of NCA, and also to be able to work with the publications and the presses that are represented here at the convention. I mean, that's an important connection, because those are venues for individuals to be able to publish their dissertations and their thesis work, and then to gain a place within the organization and continue to create a sense of diversity there. So I certainly hope that in the coming years there will be other individuals who might be grad students now, assistant professors now, who can put themselves where perhaps they don't belong and be successful and help the organization grow and prosper. Thank you.
Next, we have Dr. Gordon Nakagawa, who we have down for California State University, Northridge. Has been other places since.
I've had a checkered career. I'm an emeritus professor of Communication Studies and Asian American Studies at California State University, Northridge. But I bounced around to Hamline University for a couple of years as an administrator, and now I made the big mistake of becoming a diversity and equity consultant. I started in 2008, which was the year of the recession, so I have brilliant timing, as always. In any case, I'm very pleased and equally honored to be among this very esteemed panel. I'm going to demonstrate very early why I may not also belong among this esteemed panel. I want to start with a story on myself about my reflection in the mirror as a kind of perennial dweeb. And it's, for me, it's not just looking at my reflection in the mirror, but kind of stumbling and crashing through it. So I arrive at NCA a couple of days ago, and one of the first things I notice is the convention badges and the lanyards. And for a brief moment, I asked myself, I'm walking around looking at these things, and I'm saying, who are all these people named Bedford? and where in the world is St. Martin's University? Did NCA all of a sudden get a membership spike from the academics in the Caribbean? And I said, wow, this is great for La Raza. Alberto is going to be thrilled about this. So, major dweeb. So now I do know about sponsorships and need for external funding for receptions and tchotchkes like fancy lanyards. But I didn't know that NCA actually grants naming rights for fancy lanyards. I didn't realize we had naming rights for anything, but we do for receptions and all kinds of things, which is fine. I understand the fiscal realities and how important it is to seek those kinds of donations. I don't want to make too much of this or take a gratuitous shot at NCA's financial supporters, but I think it is also emblematic of something that has happened in nonprofit organizations, educational organizations, professional organizations. That's the corporatization, of these organizations in a way that I think represents a kind of corporate colonization of our academic life world. And what I want to suggest is that this can, under some circumstances, refract and distort our reflection in the mirror as members of NCA. What I fear most is that somehow we look in the mirror and what we see staring back at us is a Walmart greeter. I mean, that's the potential danger of colonizing our culture corporately, with an eye toward being underwritten by outside interests. Recognizing the fiscal realities, I am concerned about what that signifies about what I would call NCA's ambience. And I want to look at the notion of our ambient experience at NCA. I think this kind of corporate element is part of our ambience. I think also diversity, equity, and inclusivity are part of the ambience of NCA for both good and not so good. So I don't want to make too much of this metaphor, but I think this notion of ambience is sort of an important one. There is also, I want to say, historically, an ambience that we can trace back to both past and some remnants of in the present, an ambience of what I would call epistemic violence. This is a term that was developed by both Gayatri Spivak and Foucault, and they talk about the ways in which certain kinds of epistemological violence has been done against people of color, against women, against people with disabilities, against class-based forms of knowledge and practices and so forth. And to some extent, NCA's past history certainly has represented that. If you look at the journals, for example, historically, you have to go a long way into our 100-year history before you see a person of color showing up in any of the major journals. QJS, if you just track those, you see certainly a spike in those sorts of representations from different communities, but it was a very long time coming. It was 60 years into the publication of what was originally the Quarterly Journal of Public Speaking and now QJS, before we saw names of scholars of color prominently. And with respect to Asian American scholars, it really wasn't until the 60s and 70s and 80s that we began to see any names showing up in QJS. And so there's something about this kind of what I call epistemic violence, which is a way of disappearing and, in some sense, making invisible marginalized communities in our history, and there are elements of that there. And I want to reaffirm part of what Carolyn was suggesting about the distance that we have traveled. And I also recognize that our caucus and division, the Asian Pacific American caucus and division, stands on the shoulders of those who came before us. The Black Caucus, the Women Caucus, the La Raza group, all of these were important allies as we came late to the table in the early 1990s and institutionalized ourselves as a caucus and then later as a division. The mirror metaphor, I think, is very important because I think what we have a tendency to see even now is that when we look in the mirror as communities of color or marginalized communities involving disability, LGBT issues, and others, we have a tendency to reflect back the iconic image standing in the background. It's like they're photobombing us. These 17 white men who were the originators of NCA, who were likely heterosexual, we don't know for sure, certainly likely Christian, yeah, we don't know, and without apparent disabilities. And so we already have a kind of normative benchmark, so to speak, for the history of NCA, and we have them photobombing us in a variety of ways. They're still looking over our shoulders in the mirror. And so I'm arguing that, part of what the caucuses and divisions and communities of color have done is help to break the mirror. It's a little like Alice Through the Looking Glass, except that we had to struggle and fight our way through it, and we ended up turning the mirror into shards. Those broken shards are part of our history, and the broken shards really are representative of the communities that have fought for recognition, and I include all of the major non-dominant communities that have traveled through NCA from its inception. So, let me extend the metaphor just one step further, and I'll talk a bit about the caucus and where we came from. A second challenge has been to reflect not only on our fine selves as we look in the reflection, but more to the point, looking at how it is that we, in crashing through the looking glass that exists now begin to envision and prefigure another possible world for us and for NCA by re-looking at the kind of alternative realities that exist for communities of color in NCA and in our scholarship, which has frequently been buried. You know, there have been a lot of recent histories of communication studies, and there's one recently that's an excellent overview with wonderful essays about the 100-year centennial of NCA. But even in that excellent volume, if you look for any mentions of people of color, there are a couple of chapters by people of color. There's at least one or two about by LGBT scholars and women scholars as well. Other references are virtually non-existent, and virtually no references to Latinos and Asian Pacific Americans in all of those essays. What I'm calling for, in part, is a kind of alternative history along the lines of what Howard Zinn provided in the People's History of the U.S. I think we could benefit all of the association from a people's history of NCA and a people's history of communication studies. We don't have any archives except for those things that have been archived in the caucuses, in the divisions, in our publications that would provide us a way of looking at the kind of fertile ground that these communities of color and other communities that have been marginalized have provided in the past for us, you know, over the course of the 100 years that we've been here. So I think one of the things that we can begin to think about is, in breaking through this mirror, how can we provide alternative looks and profiles of what we in fact have provided. The Asian Pacific American Caucus didn't really get started until 1991, and that was in Atlanta. And I put up a hand-scrawled note on a message board. This is before all this electronic messaging stuff, right? And it basically said, if you're interested in forming an Asian American caucus, show up in a room. We're going to occupy a room. This is early Occupy movement, yeah. So Tom Nakayama and I showed up. So we were a caucus of two of us in a room, which we got kicked out of because we weren't supposed to be there. So we could have just laid down and gone, but we left. But so the two of us started, we found another room, and shortly thereafter, I just found out yesterday, Dan Molden showed up. He looked in the door, saw the two of us, and then went away. He came back. So there were three of us, and that's how it got started. Shortly thereafter, we began a listserv. This was a kind of early electronic community, and we added people like Kent Ono, Kate Motoyama, as several others, Kathy Wong Lau, and a number of others who joined this community to try to begin to get this off the ground. And so I went to this panel yesterday, and like the others here, when I first attended NCA, you had to scour the place to find any Asian Americans. And the way that we determined how many Asian Americans were in the association at that time was that I went into the directory and counted Asian surnames. I mean, that's what it was. Yesterday at the meeting, what I saw were dozens of Asian Americans, and all around the conference, I said this rather indelicately and crudely, you could throw a rock and you would hit an Asian. And this is how much things have changed, and I think it's a remarkable shift. Now, there are many other things that I think we can talk about. My time has already run out, but I do want to suggest that we need a couple of things to continue to look at. Again, some kind of archival history of people of colors and our scholarship and our pedagogy and the sorts of practices that we have contributed to the organization. And lastly, something that the Inter-Caucus Committee and others have sought for a long time is a census of NCA's membership. Over the past 100 years, we don't have any clue about how many people of color are actually members of NCA. We know members of our caucuses, we know numbers in our divisions. We have no clue about how many African Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, or Asian Pacific Americans, not to mention Native Americans and others, occupy this association. This is something that we can act on. It would serve as a benchmark and tell us where we've come from and where we have yet to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Terry Nance from Villanova University.
We'll have a double timer working, so we will not make a mistake. Hello, and I am very glad to be here. And I think it's been a recurrent theme in saying, I don't know why I am here when I think of the incredible shoulders that I stand on. And so it is a great honor to be addressing the camera and addressing the people here today. Well, this is going to be a personal narrative. But it's going to be combined, I think, with a narrative of the organization as well. I don't know how else to teach, I don't know how else to speak unless I'm telling a story. So, it all began for me shortly after Christmas in the early 70s. I'll not say exactly the date. My debate and forensic coaches were trying desperately to convince me that I should pursue a career in higher education. And so they managed to take a few dollars from the Emerson College debate fund and allow me to come to, yes, Chicago and the Palmer House. And it was quite thrilling as a senior in college to go to. They took me to a few general sessions, but then said it would be best if I went on my own. Well, back then I had hair, big hair. So there was no doubt that I was an African American kid. Remember the 70s. So, and I was pursuing, at that time, speech pedagogy. And so since I was in the speech pedagogy track, I thought I would go to an instructional panel and look at some issues related to speech education. Well, I will never forget. It was a large room, really crowded, and the first presentations were marginally interesting, and then the questions and answers were asked for. After a few went by, a short, light brown-skinned woman stood up, and she began to challenge the speakers to think about the impact of their theories on classroom practices, especially on non-majority students in general and black students in particular. I would later learn that that eloquent and unrelenting voice I heard belonged to one Dr. Lucia Hawthorne of Morgan State. What was so appalling to me, even as a know-nothing senior in college, was the horrifying condescension and indifference shown by the panelists and indeed the rest of the audience toward Professor Hawthorne, the supporters around her, and the issues she raised. I have to say that the impact of that stayed with me. I questioned my debate coaches, and they regretfully told me, well, it's just that we need more people of color, they said minorities, in the conference, and that's why you would be so important. I went home, I thought about it, and took a job in corporate America. At this point in my story, I must pause to say that the best transition I could think of comes from the book of Genesis, and in the telling of the creation story, when it said, when things looked darkest, evening came and morning followed. My life in corporate America was short and awful, and I returned to school. I did stay away from conferences during my master's degree, but as an intrepid PhD student, I started again, first with regional conferences before I would come back to the national conference. At the Eastern Communication Association meeting, I had the incredible fortune of meeting what I would call the amazing women of the East. I was befriended by Debbie Atwater, Beshetta Merritt, and of course, the indomitable Dr. Melbourne Cummings. Under their guidance, I learned how to navigate Eastern Communication Association and how to get ready to take on and stand up to the Speech Communication Association, SCA, that later became NCA. I remember going to one of my first NCA conferences, and that I actually got into paper accepted. Dr. Cummings was the chair of the panel, and I had the temerity to suggest on that panel that in public speaking courses, it was more important for African American students to learn how to persuade and to argue rather than to learn the critical difference between with and with. that indeed, that African American vernacular English, if you can, I'm reliving this at this moment, had validity and value, and that our role as educators was to help students develop a strategic sense of communication so that they would know when and where to use it. Well, when I was finished, you would have thought I said, "So's your mother." The audience was not having any of it. In retrospect, I can see how the good and wise Dr. Cummings allowed the audience conversation to go on just long enough for me to understand the true nature of the resistance my pedagogical stances would invoke. But she also managed the conversation long enough to hold some of the most sharply held concerns at bay. What I can say now is that evening came, but morning followed. I did stay around, and I did continue to give my papers, even finding a few of them reaching publication. And in the 80s and 90s, the Black Caucus was the place for me to come and to be replenished. Along with several other scholars, our academic egos in the Black Caucus were allowed to develop, and we were encouraged to face the field. What was made clear to us as young scholars was that we could not simply stay within the nurturing confines of the Black Caucus, that we needed to get up and out and to get our work included in the major divisions of the association. And so we did. In 1992, I had the privilege of taking over the Black Caucus, and I think it is safe to say that no one who ever administrated the Black Caucus ever did it by themselves. I was able to draw on the wisdom of Bashetta Merritt, Carolyn Calloway Thomas, Lindry Niles, Dorothy Williamson Ige, and so many other leaders. Not only that, I was also able to encourage the next generation of leaders. When I think about them, they included Dwight Brooks, Rick Rigsby, and Jeffrey Lynn Woodyard. Also at that time, as Alberto said, I had the privilege of leading the affirmative action intercaucus group. In fact, I did them simultaneously. I was a bit of an overachiever. But one of the things that I was able to do, and I specifically remember with both Alberto and with Tom Nakayama, being able to talk about the template that the Black Caucus could give to encourage the other caucuses to develop, grow, and flourish. When I think back then, we all had to fight for our panels, fight to raise our own funds, and ultimately fight to be a division. As I think back on all of that, the time and relationships, I can proudly say that it was the resilience that I learned within the caucus that helped us lead the National Communication Association to a new place. So then evening came and morning followed. When I think about the present, I think we have now been able to turn diversity, mere diversity, into inclusion. While I was always happy to see more Black, brown, and different looking faces among our colleagues, what was more important to me was that the thinking and the discipline also changed. And this is the challenge of today. We have to keep looking at the practices by which this field is known and make sure that they are accountable to the differences that exist in the world. So as I think about it, I would conclude with the words of Paulo Freire. When I think about the people I have known, when I think about what happened to me, a little girl from Cleveland who was scared off by her first conference, later came back and was given the incredible opportunity to lead. I think of Paulo Freire, who once observed that men and women are human beings because they are historically constituted as beings of praxis, beings of action and reflection. And in the process, they become capable of transforming the world and giving it meaning. I am so proud to be sitting here among some of the most important people I know at the National Communication Association who have given this organization incredible new and significant meaning.
Finally, we have, won't open. Finally, we have Young Kim, who will be speaking as our final presenter.
Yes, hi. My name is Young Kim, and some of you may know that Kim is a Korean last name. So I might be the only one who came from another country. Yeah. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
So I might offer something a little bit different as an international student. And by the way, you and I might be about the same age. Okay. In the early 70s. Yeah. So my association with NCA began 1972. So that's a long time as a master's degree student in studying communication at the University of Hawaii. And then came to Northwestern University for my PhD, finished my PhD in 1976. But I became NCA members and presented papers from 1971 or 2, I can't remember. So this has been a long association, over 40 some years. And so I have been so blessed to have developed myself through all the opportunities that were given to me and continue to be provided through this amazing organization. And perhaps because I was from another country, I didn't really think about my race or ethnicity or anything like that. So when I was invited to this panel in diversity, I focused my attention to intellectual diversity as opposed to ethnic or racial or gender, sex orientation, and so on. And I have witnessed over the years a tremendous diversification of the way of scholarship about in studying communication, how we view communication and how we approach it methodologically, philosophically, and how we ask questions and what you focus on, and then how we investigate, how we interpret and make conclusions, and so on. And I think that this diversification, intellectual diversification, is reflected in the amazing number of divisions and interest groups, and used to be also commissions and caucuses. Yeah, it's almost 100 something. Yeah, if I remember correctly. And so I wanted to focus my attention on that. I think that it is inevitable that any comprehensive academic organization like NCA has to inevitably become more complex in organization in terms of diversification of interest, because it's by nature of the phenomenon that we all commonly investigate, which is communication itself, which is really one of the two basic life processes. Our human existence takes form basically in a physical life, which is a physical, biological exchange of energy and matter with the environment. But then the other half is information exchange with the environment. And so broadly thinking about communication, you can take this communication in any direction you want, right? So over time, as the field grows, it inevitably becomes more complex and diversified. So it is a natural progression or evolution of this field of study, as reflected in the organization of the NCA. Now, as an organization or field of study becomes diversified, there is potential set of perils or the dangers, and I think that many people have mentioned this and discussed this, and more recently, more increasingly so, people are concerned about the field of communication itself. Some people prefer not to use the word discipline because we are just so that diffused. Unlike psychology and anthropology and political science, etc., we are a kind of a field of study as opposed to a discipline that has a certain degree of agreed upon assumptions and about how we study and what we study and so on. And so I personally tend to prefer a field of study, and I think that we should be very proud of that. Actually, it comes with all kinds of benefits, from which I have personally benefited tremendously in my own scholarly efforts over the 4 decades or so. In other words, there is very little orthodoxy in what to do, what not to do, how to do things. And this translates into tremendous amount of intellectual freedom to come up with ideas and pursue your ideas in the way you feel is the best way to understand a particular phenomenon. And in my own case, I was always feeling free to reach beyond the field of study called communication and make my work really interdisciplinary across the board, from political science all the way to psychology, and all of these put together into the framework of communication. And as you know, the modern study of communication, Everett Rogers, Wilbur Schramm, our modern communication study as a sort of a social science, was conceived and began as an interdisciplinary field of study. And I feel so lucky to have come to this field, to have found this field, and then pursue this tremendously free enterprise called communication study, and have developed my own theories, which I feel offer something very unique that psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists would not even think about. And so I think this is a blessing that we should be celebrate at this 100 years of life as an association. But then peril is that, as I have also witnessed this tendency to become over-specializing our studies. So we tend to kind of categorize ourselves into particular area of study, whether it's African American study or Hispanics, or even with gender studies and so on, and kind of lose interest to make an effort to see big picture as to what you're focusing on, how that relates to all these related investigations that have happened in the past, how we cross-fertilize what we study with all the other directly or indirectly related knowledge base that is out there. And so over-specialization tends to lead to fragmentation of the field. As we become more and more specialized and more fragmented, then we tend to move in the direction of the danger of losing a cohesion that is needed as a field of study. And I think that that's something that we need to be mindful of as we move to the next toward the next 100 years of our NCA, as well as a field of study called communication. Do I have time left?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And however, I would say that if I weigh this potential pitfall with the tremendous advantage of being given this freedom to pursue without being encumbered by the orthodoxies, I would still prefer this field over. Yeah, and so it's let some people be very creative, imaginative, and come up with something that is truly outstanding. And I think that we have actually produced in communication something very, very special. Things, theories that no other discipline could have produced. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So overall, I truly feel grateful for NCA and for having given me all these opportunities over the years to present, to listen to people, and to be inspired, and to have given the opportunity to serve in the Division of Intercultural Communication, International Intercultural Communication Division, as a chair and vice chair and so on, and also editor of the annual that Elle was talking about. And it's just been wonderful. And so let's just be mindful of this potential danger of falling in the trap of over-specializing, and try to reach out and make an effort to reach out and integrate our knowledge together so that we, as a field of study, remains cohesive. Thank you.
I have to say that unlike the other people here at the table, I know exactly why I'm here. And it is because of you. It is because of your scholarship, because of your activism, because of your activism through scholarship. And I just individually want to thank all of you.
Thank you for
And
putting
thank
this
you for
together.
inviting us.
So now we have about 15 minutes, and I would like to open up for questions, comments, stories from our audience. Oh yes, please step to the mic or have it passed down to you.
I think this is in response to Dr. Gordon's conceptualization of corporate colonization. I definitely agree that's something that's really happening within this discipline now. But how do you think, what are some ways that we can practically resist corporate colonization within the discipline, within the field?
Well, that's the ultimate question, certainly. We have become so dependent now on external funding, and it's just, I don't mean to, again, completely dismiss the value of subsidizing certain kinds of things like receptions, which are gathering places for a range of different people to come together, and that itself is of value. It is, on the other hand, a way of, I think, submitting and surrendering to some extent a degree of autonomy. As much as I think these are very attractive, I'm not going to use this again. This is a waste of resources in many respects. I have nothing against Bedford or St. Martin. I think St. Martin's Island is a beautiful place. And Bedford is a very fine publisher. I think we need to look at ways that we overspend. I'm going to sound a little bit like a Republican here, but then we need to look at resources and our commitment of resources and what do we need and what don't we really need. This is an ongoing issue for academic and professional organizations that are nonprofit. I don't have any magic responses or solutions to this. I'm just concerned about the way that we begin to be embedded in and with sectors that implicitly contribute to an ambiance that I'm not sure is in the best interest of an academic organization. I'd rather see us reach out and find ways to use those resources to assist communities within the organization rather than using them for tchotchkes. Looking at the ways that they could support, for example, and contribute to travel funds, the graduate student travel funds, are the ways that they can support other communities and divisions within the organization. I would have less problem with that. I like food too, and I like receptions. But I think some of that, is a bit excessive, and we can find ways perhaps of redistributing those donations and those funds in ways that are more substantial and substantive in promoting diversity, equity, and social justice within our organization.
Thank you.
Funny we're so close, but yeah, I'm just wondering if you might expand upon what areas of diversity that we might still need to work on. Diversity is very widely defined, as Professor Kim suggested, in terms of epistemology and approaches to research. Are there areas that are still challenges for us?
Well, I think one of the huge challenges that confronts us today is what are we doing with our scholarship? Mark C. Taylor, in his book, Crisis on Campus, makes the point that we are becoming over-specialized. And he raises the question of whether we are writing more and more about less and less.
Yeah.
So I think those are pivotal questions that we need to grapple. But in one of my presentations this morning, I said that we're living in an age of relevance. And that age of relevance imposes upon us a set of capitals: intellectual capital, social capital, and symbolic capital. And as far as I'm concerned, we need to think about the extent to which our scholarship is helping us grapple with misery in the world. You know, the extent to which our scholarship is helping us to grapple with issues of climate change, helping individuals to think beautifully and well, helping individuals to be curious, and helping individuals to make a mark in the world. And I'm afraid to say that one of the reasons why perhaps the NCA, I was going to say NCC, but the NCA is inviting these companies to participate is to offset funds for us. I mean, I wonder how much would we have to charge in terms of convention fees? How much would we have to charge in terms of hotel accommodations? And I remember a time when we paid $100 for a room. And how much are our rooms today at the Hilton per night? 150 some dollars. I mean, and so too much. But I am somewhat grateful to corporations for helping us to offset. But I do agree with you that there is this fine balance, this fine line that we should be careful. But back to your point, I think that those are some things that we could really focus our attention.
May I add, this is a difficult one, and I don't even know exactly how to make it. It doesn't fit easily into a caucus. One of the interesting things, as many of us, I have the great honor of serving my university as an administrator. And for so long, I thought I knew students, I knew disciplines, I knew everything, as faculty are wont to know. I had no idea of an invisible population on my campus, and that was the poor. Mm-hmm. Many times we go out of our way to make sure that we have the requisite number of Pell Grant eligible students in our classroom so that we can pat ourselves on the back and say we did our thing. But I have been struggling with how is it, just getting your tuition paid does not even begin to account for the costs of college. I don't care what kind of college you are. So where does this go? So now I think about what happens when those students grow up and we encourage them to become professionals. Can they come to a professional association conferences? The grants are wonderful. They're small.
Yes.
And they're not consistent. And so I'm always asking myself when I have meetings, who's not at the table? And I wonder if the nature even of what we're doing is exclusive of people who are operating in some really difficult economic times. And I know, again, I am at a university we're flush, quite frankly. I know that our CFO would not like me to say that, but in comparison, I have heard, and I think we all have heard stories of colleagues who simply are getting no money to travel.
Mm-hmm. If I did not have a pretty hefty research fund, I would have to bear this responsibility myself. But back to the economic issue, and I think that's the driver here.
Yes.
Jim Cliff, yes, go on. I was just going to make this.
Also, this may be a little bit of a difficult issue for me to talk about because I haven't thought about this until at this moment. But I think that academic communities as a whole, on the whole, including associations like NCA, I think we would like to encourage more diversity ideologically. I think there is a tendency to have a dominant ideology, that political ideology, that gives premium to certain social positions or political positions. But then there are quiet, silent people who have different ideas. So, for example, if the NCA had an arrangement with a hotel. This has happened several times. Do you remember? One time was LA or San Diego, yeah. And then for some reason the labor dispute, yeah.
Yes, right.
And then there are certain members of the NCA who wanted boycott. And so it was a huge, difficult challenge that NCA had to go through. And I bet that there are a lot of NCA members who didn't agree with that position, meaning that we should boycott that hotel. So now, you may agree with that position, but then there might be other people who disagree with that position. So as an organization, how do you reconcile that? How do you make a decision like that? And so it's a truly diverse organizations, just as diverse societies like the United States should be mindful of this diversity of views, including ideological, political point of view. And I think that especially academic organizations like NCA should not be dictated by a particular point of view.
Gentleman over there.
Yes. Oh, yeah, right.
Hi, my name is Dave. I kind of sort of both wandered into this meeting, but also wandered into the field from a sort of very circuitous route. And so my question is, about the types of questions, not that have been allowed to be asked, but have been allowed to be listened to. So I think, is it Professor Nance from Cleveland? I'm also from Cleveland, so that's how I remember.
Cleveland rocks.
This beautiful anecdote about questions are asked, right? And it's about the legibility of those questions and the engagement of those questions at the level of scholarship, negotiation, discursive negotiations amongst peers, et cetera, et cetera. And so the one hand is, I'm curious about the history of diverse engagement in the field of communication and the types of questions that have been able to be asked and listened to over time, right? And then also what I think there's really good attention to class or poverty, right? Points to types of questions that we still aren't engaging in, right? What will this continued engagement in diversity do for our ability to engage in questions, to listen to questions at a at a theoretical level, right? At a methodological level, at the level of object domain, right? And this is, again, someone who sort of wandered into this field and is familiar with these sort of interventions in other fields, right? So I know what Playing in the Dark did for the study of literature, right? I know what Darlene Clark Hine did for the study of history, right? And so I'm just interested, what is that legacy at the level of inquiry, scholarly inquiry for the field of communication, and then also how can that be a way of thinking forward? So that's my question.
Yes.
Oh, is there a response?
Is that a question? I thought it was directed to Nance. Professor.
Oh. I have no. I have.
Okay.
And what I will say is, I have no. That is, I'm really sitting here pondering what exists in our field that's at the level of playing in the dark. That is a very good question. Thinking about playing in the dark, thinking of the Hine work. I don't know. I might need to think about that. So,
What about you? Do you have some ideas? The questioner.
Do I have some
Yeah.
ideas? No, I mean, so again, I have only ideas because I'm sort of raw to this field, and so I'm seeing, so I'm at Northwestern right now, and I'm seeing the way in which our department has thought through its own faculty and the changes that it has brought to the types of projects that are sort of worked through by graduate students. And also we're at an interesting year in which all of our first year cohort are all international students. Which has kind of allowed at least me to think about the under-scrutinized Americanist engagement of the types of projects, the methodological and sort of object domain movements that we have. It is, of course, the National Communication Association of sort of scholars in the United States, but also there are plenty of other fields, even in American studies, that are thinking critically about the hemispheric, right, or the sort of the Americanist implications of their field. And so I'm seeing sort of the ways in which questions are opening up and are sort of pushing back at other people's scholarship, just in kind of the most in front of my face kind of way. And I'm curious about the history of discipline, of our discipline, my discipline now, also because I'm broadly curious about histories of disciplines and the interactivity between, I don't know, social justice movements and the way that the infrastructure of higher education is changing, and the opportunities and the foreclosures that have sort of happened at the other end of, the 60s, basically. So I don't have an answer. It's an inquiry, but I'm happy to draw upon all of your experience and sort of ask, what are the questions that were able to be asked, right, by being able to listen to the questions that are at the table.
I think that was a statement that was made. So ask another question.
Is there another?
Oh, she has another one.
Do we have time?
How much time we have? About 2
We
more.
have 3 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to make this as quick as I can, but this is relating to a comment I heard earlier, specifically how NCA has been successful in acknowledging the dignity of its members. And while I do agree that that statement is true to an extent, also I feel NCA could get better at that. So my question to you is how to balance recognizing that we have come far, but at the same time realizing that we still have a far way to go.
I think I mentioned that. And I would say that for me, when I think of Charles C. Taylor's book on multiculturalism and recognition, and we makes the point that the most important thing for people of color, for women, and other individuals who've been outside the boundaries of dignity, the most important thing is recognition. And that's a beginning point. To recognize the dignity of humanity in other people. I mean, I don't know where else you want to start. That's a huge thing to do, is to say, I see you. It's a huge thing to do to say, I take you seriously. It's a huge thing to say, you matter. And then when you start from that perspective, then you can move out into other dimensions, because if you matter, if I take you seriously, if I care about you, then there are practices that should follow from the caring. And I'm arguing that although the NCA has not done all the things that it should have done, I think that it has begun to recognize people and to say, we want to be inclusive. And that's my posture with regard to that. And that dignifies people within the association.
I'm going to step outside of my chair role and say something that has stuck with me since graduate school that my advisor,
Thank you.
who may or may not be sitting next to me, once told me that when you make it through the gate, it is your responsibility to turn around and open that gate for other people. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one of the most important things that has stuck with me.
And the last thing I will add there is when you open the gate, you make sure that just opening the gate may get some people through, but others may require some other kinds of assistance to make sure that they're rolling through the gate. So that it becomes important, not just, I think it's important to recognize dignity, but again, maybe because I am an administrator and I live my life in details, what I think NCA could maybe do better is in following up on the details of making sure that we are providing the kinds of access and accessible to everyone.
Thank you so much for coming, and a thank you for our panelists.